What if I told you that the most powerful nation in Europe today didn't even exist 200 years ago? That the country we know as Germany was once a patchwork of over 300 tiny kingdoms, duchies and principalities, scattered across Central Europe like pieces of a broken mirror? This is the story of how one kingdom, Prussia, transformed from a backward military state into an empire that would shake the foundations of Europe. Through blood and iron, through 3 calculated wars, and through the genius of one man who understood that nations aren't built through speeches and votes, but through firepower and ruthless determination. This is the story of how Germany fought its way into existence. From 1815 to 1918, when Napoleon Bonaparte finally fell in 1815, defeated at Waterloo by British and Prussian forces, Europe's diplomats gathered in Vienna to remake the map of the continent. They faced a problem. Before Napoleon's conquests, Germany had been the Holy Roman Empire, a confusing mess of more than 300 independent states, each with its own ruler, its own army, its own currency, and its own laws. Some were kingdoms the size of small countries. Others were city-states you could walk across in an afternoon. Some were ruled by archbishops, others by dukes whose territories were barely larger than a manor estate. Napoleon had swept through this chaos like a wildfire, consolidating these hundreds of petty principalities into just 39 states. The diplomats at the Congress of Vienna looked at this new map and made a decision that would change history. They weren't going to restore the 300 mini-states. That was insanity. Instead, they created the German Confederation, a loose alliance of 39 states designed to keep the peace in Central Europe. It wasn't a nation. It wasn't even close to a unified government. It was more like a gentleman's club where German-speaking rulers agreed to cooperate when absolutely necessary. The 2 most powerful members of this confederation were Austria, the ancient Habsburg Empire that had dominated Central Europe for centuries, and Prussia, a militaristic kingdom in the north that most Europeans still considered a backwater. For nearly 50 years, these 39 states existed in an uneasy balance, with Austria and Prussia circling each other like rival predators, each wanting to control the future of the German-speaking world, but neither strong enough to make the decisive move. But something was changing beneath the surface. Nationalism, the idea that people who spoke the same language and shared the same culture should live together in one nation-state, was spreading like a virus across Europe. Germans began asking themselves a dangerous question. Why should we be divided into dozens of separate states when the French have France and the British have Britain? Why can't German speakers have Germany? This nationalism exploded in 1848 when revolutions erupted across Europe. In German cities, protesters took to the streets demanding a unified German nation with a constitution, civil rights, and an elected parliament. For a brief, glorious moment, it seemed like the dream might come true. An elected assembly met in Frankfurt to draft a constitution for a united Germany. They even offered the crown of this new German empire to King Frederick William IV of Prussia. But Frederick William shocked them. He refused. He called the crown offered by commoners a crown from the gutter, not worth accepting. Without Prussian military power, the Frankfurt Parliament's dreams collapsed. Austrian and Prussian troops crushed the revolutions. Thousands of German liberals fled to America. The dream of German unity seemed dead. But something crucial had changed. The question was no longer if Germany would unite, but how and under whose leadership. And in Prussia, a new leader was rising who had very definite ideas about the answer. In 1862, King William I of Prussia appointed a reactionary Junker aristocrat named Otto von Bismarck as his minister-president. Bismarck was 47 years old, a giant of a man with a walrus mustache and eyes like chips of ice. He'd spent years as a diplomat, learning how European power politics really worked, not how idealists wished they worked. Within weeks of taking office, Bismarck made a speech to the Prussian parliament that would define his entire career. He told them that the great questions of the day would not be settled by speeches and majority decisions. That was the mistake of 1848 and 49, but by blood and iron. The liberals were horrified. The conservatives loved it, and Bismarck meant every word. He had a plan, a vision that would take decades to accomplish, but he could see it clearly. Germany would unite, but it would unite under Prussian domination, led by Prussian armies, and it would happen through war. Not one war, not two, but three carefully planned, precisely executed wars that would eliminate every obstacle to Prussian supremacy. And he had already identified his targets: Denmark, Austria, and France. Take them down in order, and the path to German Empire would be clear. The First War came in 1864, and it seemed almost too small to matter. Denmark controlled two duchies, Schleswig and Holstein, on its southern border. These territories were populated mostly by Germans who wanted to join the German Confederation. When Denmark tried to incorporate Schleswig more tightly into the Danish kingdom, Bismarck saw his opportunity. He convinced Austria to join Prussia in a war against Denmark to liberate the German-speaking duchies. This was political genius. By allying with Austria, Bismarck ensured that German nationalists would support the war. By making Austria his partner, he was setting up his next move. The war was short and brutal. Prussian and Austrian armies, armed with modern rifles and backed by superior artillery, crushed the Danish forces in weeks. At the Battle of Dibble, Prussian infantry stormed Danish fortifications in a display of military efficiency that shocked Europe. Denmark, a small nation fighting alone, had no chance. By October 1864, Denmark surrendered, giving up Schleswig and Holstein. But here's where Bismarck's cunning truly showed. Instead of a clean division of the territories, he arranged for Prussia and Austria to jointly administer the duchies. This created exactly the kind of administrative nightmare and tension Bismarck wanted. He needed Austria angry, frustrated, and ready to fight, because Austria was next on his list. By 1866, Bismarck had carefully maneuvered Austria into an impossible position. The joint administration of Schleswig-Holstein had created constant friction. Bismarck deliberately provoked disputes, knowing Austria would eventually lose patience. He also secured crucial diplomatic insurance. He made a secret alliance with Italy, promising them Austrian territory if they joined Prussia in a war against Austria. He received assurances from France that they would stay neutral. He modernized the Prussian army under the brilliant Chief of Staff Helmuth von Moltke, equipping Prussian infantry with the revolutionary breech-loading Dreiss needle gun, a rifle that could be loaded and fired 3 times faster than the muzzle loading, weapons still used by Austria. When war finally came in June 1866, Austria felt confident. They had larger armies. They had the support of most German states. They had centuries of prestige as Europe's great power. They expected a long war that would end with Prussia humiliated and Austrian dominance restored. They were catastrophically wrong. The war lasted 7 weeks. Just 7 weeks. At the Battle of Königgrätz on July 3, 1866. The largest battle fought in Europe since Napoleon's defeat. 200,000 Austrian troops faced a slightly smaller Prussian force. The Austrians fought with desperate courage, their white-coated infantry advancing in parade ground, formations that had won battles for 100 years, and the Prussians slaughtered them. The Dreiss needle gun allowed Prussian soldiers to fire lying down, protected behind cover, while Austrian troops had to stand to reload their muzzle loaders. Prussian artillery tore holes in Austrian formations. The Prussian railway system had allowed Moltke to concentrate his armies with unprecedented speed, hitting the Austrians before they could fully mobilize. By nightfall, the Austrian army was shattered. 24,000 Austrians were dead or wounded. 48,000 were captured. Prussia had won the decisive battle in a single afternoon. But here, Bismarck revealed the other side of his genius. Not just knowing how to win wars, but knowing when to stop. Many Prussian generals wanted to march on Vienna, to humiliate Austria completely, to parade Prussian troops through the Habsburg capital. Bismarck refused. He imposed a peace treaty that was deliberately moderate. Austria lost no Austrian territory. They paid a small indemnity. They agreed to dissolve the old German Confederation and accept Prussian dominance in northern Germany. That was all. No humiliation, no occupation, no territorial annexation that would create permanent Austrian hatred. Bismarck wanted Austria neutral in the future, not vengeful. He'd learned the lesson that Napoleon forgot. When you defeat an enemy, give them terms they can accept. Or you create an enemy who will never stop seeking revenge. The moderate peace with Austria meant that when Bismarck fought his next war, Austria would stay neutral. And Bismarck's next target was already in his sights: France. Napoleon III, Emperor of France, watched the Austro-Prussian War with growing alarm. For 2 centuries, France had benefited from German division. A weak, fragmented Germany meant France was the dominant land power in Europe. But now, Prussia was rapidly annexing the northern German states, creating the North German Confederation under Prussian military command. If Prussia also absorbed the southern German states, Bavaria, Württemberg, Baden, France would face a united Germany, more populous and potentially more powerful than France itself. Napoleon knew he had to stop Prussian expansion. Bismarck knew Napoleon would try. And Bismarck wanted to provoke a war with France for one simple reason. If France attacked Prussia, the southern German states, bound by secret defensive treaties with Prussia, would have to join the war. German nationalism would explode. The dream of German unity would no longer be an abstract idea, but a reality forged in the fires of war against the traditional enemy, France. All Bismarck needed was the right provocation, and in 1870 he found it. The crisis began with something absurdly minor. The Spanish throne was vacant, and Spanish politicians offered it to a German prince, Leopold of Hohenzollern-Sigmaringen, a distant relative of the Prussian royal family. France panicked. A Hohenzollern on the Spanish throne would mean German influence on France's southern border, potentially surrounding France with enemies. The French ambassador confronted King William of Prussia at the spa town of Ems, demanding that Prussia renounce any future Hohenzollern claims to the Spanish throne. King William politely refused, but reported the conversation to Bismarck in a telegram. This telegram, the Ems dispatch, was Bismarck's opportunity. He edited the telegram before releasing it to the press, shortening it, making it seem like the French ambassador had been rude, and King William had angrily dismissed him. The edited version was designed to outrage both French and German public opinion, and it worked perfectly. In Paris, crowds screamed for war. French newspapers called Prussia's response an insult to French honor. Napoleon III, politically weakened and desperately needing a military victory to restore his prestige, declared war on Prussia on July 19, 1870. Bismarck had his war. And better yet, France had started it. The southern German states immediately honored their treaties and joined Prussia. For the first time, German-speaking armies from north and south were fighting together under Prussian command. The Franco-Prussian War was supposed to be France's revenge, a chance to crush Prussian ambitions and restore French dominance in Europe. Instead, it became a disaster of almost unimaginable proportions for France. The French army had a reputation for military glory built on centuries of victories from Louis XIV through Napoleon. But reputation doesn't win wars. Organization, logistics, modern weapons, and competent leadership win wars. And in 1870, Prussia had all of those, while France had none. The Prussian General Staff, the first true modern military planning organization, had spent years preparing for exactly this war. They knew the railway schedules, the mobilization timetables, the positions where French armies would concentrate. When war was declared, Prussian railways moved 460,000 troops to the French border in 18 days. France managed to mobilize just 220,000 in the same period, and those troops were scattered, disorganized, and often without adequate supplies or ammunition. The contrast was staggering. The first major battle came on August 6th at Speicheren. French troops fought with desperate courage, but Prussian artillery dominated the battlefield. The French chassepot rifle was actually superior to the Prussian needle gun, but French artillery was obsolete, still using bronze cannons, while Prussia deployed modern steel, Krupp breech-loading guns that could fire faster, farther and more accurately. At Wörth, at Mars-la-Tour, at Gravelotte, Prussian armies shattered. French forces in battles marked by horrific casualties on both sides. But Prussia could replace its losses. France could not. The war's decisive moment came on September 1st, 1870, at the fortress town of Sedan, near the Belgian border. Napoleon III personally accompanied the French army of Chalon, 120,000 men, commanded by Marshal MacMahon, in a desperate attempt to relieve the fortress of Metz, where another French army was trapped. Instead, Prussian forces under Moltke surrounded Sedan, positioning 400 artillery pieces on the heights overlooking the town. What followed was a slaughter. For hour after hour, Prussian shells rained down on trapped French troops. French cavalry charged Prussian positions in a display of suicidal courage, trying to break the encirclement. They were cut down by rifle fire and artillery. By afternoon, Napoleon III, watching his army disintegrate, realized the battle was lost. Rather than watch more of his soldiers die, he surrendered himself, his army, and effectively, his empire. The Emperor of France was now a Prussian prisoner. The news stunned Europe. In Paris, crowds overthrew the Second Empire and proclaimed a new republic. But the war wasn't over. The new French government vowed to continue fighting, to defend France to the last breath. It made no difference. Prussian armies surrounded Paris, beginning a siege that would last 4 months. French resistance in the provinces was desperate but futile. Newly raised French armies lacked training, equipment, and experienced officers. At Le Mans, at Orléans, at Amiens, Prussian forces defeated every attempt to break the siege of Paris. By January 1871, starving Parisians were eating zoo animals. The city surrendered on January 28th. But before Paris fell, Bismarck orchestrated a moment that would define the next 75 years of European history. On January 18th, 1871, in the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles, the former residence of French kings, with Prussian troops occupying the grounds, King William I of Prussia was proclaimed Kaiser, Emperor of a new German Empire. The timing and location were deliberate humiliations for France. Every southern German state had agreed to join the empire. The dream of German unity was now reality, forged not through democratic votes but through 3 wars. Just as Bismarck had planned, the new German Empire was born in the palace of France's greatest king, in the middle of a war that proved Germany was now Europe's dominant military power. The symbolism could not have been more brutal or more clear. When the peace treaty was signed in May 1871, France was forced to pay 5 billion francs in indemnity, the equivalent of over $1 billion in gold, and ceded Alsace and part of Lorraine to Germany. These provinces contained iron ore and coal, vital industrial resources. But more importantly, their loss became a burning grievance in French national consciousness, a wound that would fester for 43 years until it helped ignite the First World War. The new German Empire was a constitutional monarchy, but one designed to ensure Prussian and conservative dominance. The Reichstag, the imperial parliament, was elected by universal male suffrage, a surprisingly democratic feature. But real power lay with the Kaiser and the Chancellor, who didn't answer to Parliament. Bismarck became the first Chancellor and would hold the position for the next 19 years, dominating German and European politics with an iron hand. The empire's constitution was a patchwork, reflecting the fact that Germany had unified not through revolution, but through conquest. 25 states retained their own monarchs, their own laws, and considerable autonomy, but Prussia was overwhelmingly dominant, containing 2/3 of Germany's population and controlling the military. The empire Bismarck created was militaristic, authoritarian, and deliberately structured to keep liberals and Democrats from real power. It was also stunningly successful, at least initially. Germany's population exploded from 41 million in 1871 to 65 million by 1910. German industry grew faster than any economy in European history except Britain during the Industrial Revolution. By 1900, Germany had surpassed Britain in steel production and was challenging for global industrial supremacy. German universities became the world's finest. German science led in chemistry, physics, engineering. German cities, rebuilt with modern sewage, electricity, and public transportation, became models of efficiency. The German army, which had won 3 wars in 7 years, was considered invincible, but success created new problems. Germany's rapid growth frightened its neighbors. France wanted revenge for 1870. Russia feared German expansion eastward. Britain watched with alarm as Germany built a powerful navy that challenged British naval supremacy. Bismarck understood these dangers and spent 2 decades managing them through a complex web of alliances. He isolated France by allying with Austria, Hungary, and Russia simultaneously, a diplomatic high-wire act that prevented any hostile coalition from forming against Germany. He convinced Britain that Germany had no colonial ambitions that threatened British interests. He portrayed Germany as a satisfied power, interested only in maintaining stability in Europe. It was a lie, but a useful one. As long as Bismarck was in charge, his system worked. But in 1888, Kaiser William I died. His son Frederick III, who might have liberalized the empire, died of throat cancer after ruling for just 99 days. The new Kaiser, William II, was 29 years old, arrogant, impulsive, and deeply resentful of Bismarck's dominance. In 1890, the young Kaiser forced Bismarck to resign. It was one of history's great mistakes. Without Bismarck's steady hand, German foreign policy became erratic and aggressive. William II let the alliance with Russia lapse, pushing Russia into an alliance with France, exactly what Bismarck had spent decades preventing. Germany began building a massive navy, openly challenging Britain's control of the seas. The Kaiser made inflammatory speeches about Germany's place in the sun, demanding colonies and international respect in tones that sounded more like threats than diplomacy. Meanwhile, German society was changing in ways that terrified the conservative elite. The Social Democratic Party, which Bismarck had tried to crush through special laws, grew into the largest party in the Reichstag by 1912. Workers organized into unions. Women demanded rights. The rigid conservative order that had built the empire was cracking under the pressure of modernity. The military leadership responded to these internal and external pressures with increasing paranoia. They developed the Schlieffen Plan, a military strategy based on the assumption that Germany would eventually have to fight a 2-front war against France and Russia simultaneously. The plan called for a massive, rapid attack through Belgium to knock France out of the war in 6 weeks, then turn east to defeat Russia. It was a gamble, a plan that required perfect execution and left no room for diplomatic flexibility. Worst of all, it required Germany to violate Belgian neutrality, which would almost certainly bring Britain into the war. By 1914, Europe was a powder keg waiting for a spark. 43 years of peace since the Franco-Prussian War had created a dangerous illusion. European leaders, remembering the short, decisive wars of 1864, 1866, and 1870, believed that future wars would also be brief. They were catastrophically wrong. When Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria was assassinated in Sarajevo on June 28, 1914, a crisis that might have been managed through diplomacy instead spiraled out of control. Austria, backed by Germany, made impossible demands on Serbia. Russia mobilized to support Serbia. Germany demanded Russia stop mobilizing, and when Russia refused, Germany declared war on Russia on August 1st. The Schlieffen Plan kicked in like a machine that couldn't be stopped. Germany declared war on France on August 3rd and invaded Belgium on August 4th. Britain, honoring its treaty obligations to Belgium, declared war on Germany. Within a week, every major European power except Italy was at war. The German armies that crossed into Belgium in August 1914 were the most powerful military force ever assembled. Nearly 4 million men, organized in divisions that moved with railway precision, equipped with modern rifles, machine guns, and artillery that could destroy fortresses. They expected to be in Paris within 6 weeks, just as the Schlieffen Plan promised. It didn't work. The German advance stalled at the Marne River in September. French and British forces, reinforced by troops rushed from Paris in taxicabs, stopped the German offensive just short of the capital. Both sides tried to outflank each other in what became known as the Race to the Sea, a series of battles that extended the front. Lines from Switzerland to the English Channel. By November 1914, the war had become something no one had anticipated. Static trench warfare. For the next 4 years, the Western Front barely moved. Millions of men faced each other across a strip of devastated land, protected by trenches, barbed wire, machine gun nests, and artillery. Attacks that gained a few miles of ground cost hundreds of thousands of lives. At Verdun in 1916, the Germans launched a massive offensive designed to bleed the French army white. It turned into a 10-month battle of attrition where both sides lost over 300,000 men, with almost nothing to show for it. At the Somme, British and French forces attacked German lines in July 1916. On the first day, the British Army suffered 60,000 casualties, the bloodiest day in British military history. The battle lasted 5 months and cost over 1 million casualties on both sides. The front moved less than 10 miles. This wasn't the short, glorious war anyone had expected. This was industrial-scale slaughter. On the Eastern Front, the war was more mobile, but no less brutal. German and Austrian forces fought Russian armies across vast distances in Poland. The Baltic states, Ukraine, the battles were enormous in scale. At Tannenberg in August 1914, German forces encircled and destroyed an entire Russian army, taking 90,000 prisoners. But even massive victories didn't end the war. Russia's population was enormous. They could replace losses that would have crippled any other nation. The German army found itself fighting a war of attrition on 2 fronts. Exactly the nightmare scenario Bismarck had warned against. German society mobilized for total war. Factories converted to munitions production. Women replaced men in factories and farms. The government controlled food distribution, raw materials, labor. But as the war dragged on, the British naval blockade began to bite. Germany couldn't import food or raw materials from overseas. By 1916, German civilians were starving. The winter of 1916 to 17 was called the turnip winter because turnips were often the only food available. Hundreds of thousands of German civilians died from malnutrition and related diseases. Meanwhile, on the front lines, German soldiers faced constant artillery bombardments, poison gas attacks, tank assaults, and the knowledge that the war seemed to have no end. In 1917, Germany made 2 desperate gambles. First, they unleashed unrestricted submarine warfare. ordering U-boats to sink any ship, including neutral vessels, approaching Britain. The goal was to starve Britain into surrender before the blockade starved Germany. But the policy brought the United States into the war in April 1917. Second, Germany helped transport Vladimir Lenin back to Russia, hoping he would take Russia out of the war by starting a revolution. This gamble worked. Lenin's Bolsheviks seized power in November 1917 and signed a peace treaty with Germany in March 1918. For the first time since August 1914, Germany only had to fight on one front. But by now, the United States was pouring fresh troops into France. Time was running out. In March 1918, Germany launched the Spring Offensive, a massive attack using tactics developed through years of trench warfare. Stormtrooper infiltration tactics, rolling artillery barrages, poison gas, flamethrowers. The German army broke through Allied lines, advancing 40 miles in some places, the deepest advance since 1914. For a few weeks, it seemed like Germany might win, but the offensive exhausted Germany's reserves. American troops arrived by the hundreds of thousands. In August, the Allies counterattacked. The German army, depleted, starving, facing fresh American divisions, began to collapse. By October, the German High Command knew the war was lost. But rather than admit defeat, they convinced the Kaiser to appoint a civilian government, which would have to sue for peace, sparing the army's reputation. On November 9, 1918, Kaiser William II abdicated and fled to the Netherlands. Germany was declared a republic. 2 days later, on November 11th, at 11 in the morning, the armistice took effect. The guns fell silent. The war was over. Germany had lost. In 4 years of war, Germany had suffered 2 million military deaths and 400,000 civilian deaths from starvation and disease. The economy was shattered. The currency was collapsing. The population was traumatized. And worse was coming. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 1919 in the same Hall of Mirrors, where the German Empire had been proclaimed in 1871, imposed crushing terms on Germany. Germany lost Alsace-Lorraine, returned to France. They lost territory to Poland, Belgium, Denmark. The German military was limited to 100,000 men. No tanks, no military aircraft, no submarines. Germany was forced to accept sole responsibility for causing the war. A humiliation that would poison German politics for decades. And Germany was ordered to pay $33 billion in reparations, a sum so enormous it would take generations to repay. The empire that Bismarck had built through blood and iron, that had dominated Europe for 47 years, was gone. In its place was a weak republic, resented by monarchists, attacked by communists, blamed for defeat by a population that couldn't accept that their mighty army had lost. In beer halls in Munich, a failed artist and war veteran named Adolf Hitler was beginning to give speeches, blaming Germany's defeat on betrayal, on Jews, on democracy itself. The seeds of an even greater catastrophe were already being planted. Because Germany hadn't learned the lesson of its founding, Bismarck had understood that military victory was meaningless without diplomatic wisdom, that defeating enemies wasn't enough. You had to give them terms they could live with. But the generation that came after Bismarck forgot that wisdom. They believed in German military supremacy without limits, in the right of the strong to dominate the weak, in war as the ultimate test of national greatness. From 1815 to 1918, Germany had transformed from a geographic expression into a unified empire, a great power that stood at the pinnacle of European civilization. And then, in 4 years of catastrophic war, it had thrown it all away.